All right, so now that we have given a quick overview of Spacefighter, before we begin our lectures on the systems and subsystems of Spacefighter, as well as the code itself, let's spend just a minute and go over some of the classes that we're going to be referencing throughout this project, classes that we have worked on in the past in this particular XNA volume, as well as the graphics we'll be using in Spacefighter. And then, at the very end of this video, let's go ahead and create the project that we're going to use for Spacefighter itself. So with that, Logan, let's go ahead and spend just a minute and talk about some of these classes that we're going to be referencing.
All right, I've established a temp folder over here on C drive under CCS, and you'll notice two things in it. One, we have a bunch of C# class files, and we have an images folder. I'll get to the images here in just a minute. What we've got here in the classes are classes that have been used in past videos and projects that covered certain game elements inside of XNA. We have, beginning from the top, we've got this actor class, which came from the animated sprite collision project. This is where we had established I think it was the cat and mushrooms animated example.
Oh, yeah.
If I actually load this class up briefly in Visual Studio, the part that I'm going to be interested in from this class for Spacefighter is the collision system. If we scroll down to the bottom, we actually have a collision region, and it is this entire region that we are simply going to grab directly and place into Spacefighter.
Okay.
This way, since the collision code is identical to the one we had shown in that project, there's no reason not to just take it directly and leverage it.
Otherwise, we would be reinventing the wheel. So no planned modifications for that section of code there?
Aside from some terminology. Of course, in Spacefighter, certain things are carried under certain names where the class itself is actually going to be called node instead of actor.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from that, there's no actual functional changes.
Okay.
So we'll simply be grabbing things like the necessary fields, our alpha threshold, and our graphics device, and the collision region. So that's our points of interest from actor. Some other classes we have in here are things like the sprite class. This specific sprite class came from the sprite loop example, sprite loop event. This is where we were using the latest version of animated sprite and demonstrating how we could use events to give a notify handler. I'm starting from this version because one, it's good to have all of the techniques used here in mind. Even though we are breaking up the sprite system into two classes, it's still a good idea to have all these principles in mind, and we're going to have the code at hand because I am going to almost directly use update and draw from within sprite. Now, the remaining three classes are the Starfield's main project, the Starfield class, and the multi-layer Starfield. These are, of course, all from the Starfield video, and these are going to be used more or less directly. Starfield and multi-layer Starfield will be placed directly into the Spacefighter project when we get to that section. And I have the main game class from the Starfield just because that had all of the actual values we used to achieve the specific Starfield effect that we had.
So with a couple of these classes, we're going to go in and just do copy and paste.
Yep.
While there are a few classes here in regards to the Starfield, we'll be using the entire class.
Yep.
Okay.
And with minimal modifications.
All right, excellent. So with that, let's go ahead and move over to the images.
All right, inside of the images folder, we have a set of images, and I'm going to start at the beginning and just walk through these and give a brief explanation. Beginning with the asteroid, this is, of course, the asteroid that will be used as one of the, I guess you could say, base enemy objects, just a non-AI object that moves down the screen towards you. You will note that there's quite a few frames in here, and this is because the asteroid was originally generated from a 3D application, so we used that to leverage smooth animation. So that's why we've got quite a few individual cells. If we move on from there, we have an enemy graphic. The sheet is arranged differently here. We have only one row of sprites, but that's all that was needed to get the animation, which only covers the engine itself. Moving on from there, we have this small orange sheet, which represents the projectiles that will be fired by enemies. There's only 4 frames of animation, but that's because these are so small compared to everything on the screen. The animation is simply given so that it doesn't look static. Moving on from here, we have an explosion graphic. I was careful to make sure that there wasn't any darkening smoke in the graphic, because if you use a large area of darkness, it will actually darken whatever the explosion happens, or explosion is happening over. So I tried to keep most of the pixels in this somewhat lighter than base gray, just so that we have a nice lightning effect, because that is what comes to mind when you have an explosion. Brightness, heat, things like that. Moving on from here, we have this tiny graphic, which if you look really close is a small yellow triangle. This is the graphic that we're going to be using for missiles at the very end when we get to the missile projectile. This graphic and the sidearm graphic that we'll see shortly were really just placeholders that never got official graphics. Any of the fully drawn or rendered graphics you see were created for the prototype video for the registration page for Spacefighter some time ago. So graphics that were needed in between there were really just improvised. Again, the focus of this project is the engine itself, and the graphics are just there to give information as needed. If we move on from here, we have a small plus symbol, which I'm using for the health power-up. The next is the letter M, which I'm using for a missile power-up. These two are, of course, used to give something to show when we get to the power-up section. Moving on from here, we have what is probably a somewhat confusing-looking graphic, and that's mostly because this graphic is drawn in white. The only parts that you can see are where the edges shadowed a little bit. This is a small ring explosion, and I use this for a projectile hit effect.
Okay.
Moving on from here, we have the player's actual ship. This is the same ship that was shown in the original demo video. I will note that the ship has been shrunk to half its original size. In order to make the ship's size fit this style of gameplay, I did need to shrink it down some, so you weren't a massive projectile-absorbing wall. I also have 3 additional variants of this because the Spacefighter engine itself does support 4 players, so I needed 3 additional variations. Each of these variations are just a very simple hue modification, really just to show that there were 4 distinct players that could be used. So if we step through the final few of these, that makes up the 4-player graphics. Moving on from here, we have the small graphic, which is 2 energy circles. This is the player's main weapon. Again, only 2 cells, just to show something other than a static animation on the player's projectile. And here we have the sidearm graphic. This, again, is basically the same graphic as the missile. This was just a placeholder to show something distinct. The original intent was to have a graphic that would look like it would snap in place on the player's ship, but running out of time for that, we left this as a placeholder.
Again, we're only focusing on the engine. That's the main thing here with this video.
And that wraps up all the graphics and brings us back around to asteroids. So again, that was just a brief explanation on why we have all these and where they're going to be used in-game.
Okay.
So with that out of the way, I think we can move over into Visual Studio and get started on our project. Here I have a new instance of Visual Studio. From inside of here, we can begin our project as an XNA game, and we can call this project Spacefighter. So OK to the project's creation. The first thing I'll do is get all of the images moved into the content subproject. So I'll grab all of these guys, drag them over there, and drop them in place into the content subproject. Now that we have our textures, one last thing I wanted to touch on in the project setup was the way that we were going to organize classes. I'm going to be setting up 2 folders, one called Engine, one called Game. The idea is that we'll have a few classes that make up the base classes that provide all of the base functionality. These will be things like the sprite sheet, the sprite, the node, and maybe a little bit of stuff having to do with events. The idea with the engine section is going to be a set of classes that are highly generic in nature and have very little to do with any game specifics. Next to that, we'll have the game folder, and that is going to have everything that comprises gameplay elements. Everything from base ships and enemies up until the final player ships and missile projectiles that we'll see on screen. So let me get both of those folders dropped into place. Again, these are engine and game. And with that, that really covers the project setup that I wanted to get accomplished. Again, showing where we're going to draw for code as we begin to put some of the element or the foundational systems in place. And we've got our images all set up, and we have our base folder set up with an idea of where we're going with the engine organization.
Okay, so with that, that is going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.